Here we begin with a new chapter. It's supply, demand, and government policies, but we won't be talking about all government policies. This is specifically related to price controls. So it's chapter 6 from the same ebook. So, price controls are of two types. You have a price ceiling, which is a legal maximum price of a particular good which is imposed by government. Remember, ceiling, you cannot go above the ceiling. So whatever the maximum price government sets, seller cannot sell above that price. You're bound to sell at this price or you can sell at any price below it, but you cannot go above the ceiling. So generally government imposes a price ceiling to benefit consumers. And then you have price floors. So it's the minimum price set by the government of any commodity or any service. So a classic example can be minimum wage law. But remember, price floors are specifically to benefit the producers. Government imposes a price which is generally above the equilibrium, and like you cannot buy something below that price. You can go above the floor, but you cannot go below the floor. So that's price floors. Generally, as free market economists, we assume that government intervention is not really good. It either leads to a surplus or a shortage because it distorts the market price, the equilibrium price of quantity demanded and supply. So, why do we need government intervention? We need government intervention because there is always a conflict between consumers and producers. As a consumer, you would prefer to pay low for every commodity you buy. And as a producer, you prefer to charge a higher price so you can increase your revenue and profit. So, though market equilibrium works very well with demand and supply, but due to existence of lobbies, as in certain groups which forces prices to either go above the equilibrium or below the equilibrium. So government intervenes in that scenario. So some good examples of price ceiling can be government might provide a cheaper, let's say any necessity good like wheat, rice, or sugar, or maybe petrol, or might keep the prices of rental apartments low. And for price floors, it can be any commodity or minimum wage, as I mentioned before. Before starting up with the graphs, I want to make one thing very clear. There is a binding price control scenario and a non-binding price control scenario. So generally, if you read somewhere or you're watching the news and you hear government is imposing a price ceiling, so it means it is a binding price ceiling. Remember, price ceiling is to benefit consumers. So usually government impose a price which is below market equilibrium because that's how they will be better off. And a binding price ceiling always lead towards a shortage. And on the other side, if you read there is a price floor or a government is imposing price floor to benefit producers because that's why they impose a price floor, it means the price whatever they impose it's above the market equilibrium. Because if the government imposes a price floor below equilibrium, how is it benefiting the producers? So they impose a price above equilibrium and this always leads towards surplus. So whether it's a binding price ceiling or a price floor, they always disrupt the market equilibrium because they change the prices and this creates a mismatch between demand and supply. But then we have scenarios of non-binding price controls, either a non-binding price ceiling or a non-binding price floor. So non-binding by term refers to you're not disrupting the equilibrium. So the equilibrium may be distorted in short run, But in long run, the market fixes itself. You may go back to the equilibrium price and have equilibrium quantity. So let's look via graph what these two things are. Here we have two scenarios for you. First one is binding price ceiling, the other one is non-binding price ceiling. So let's refer to the first case. We're analyzing the market of petrol. And initially you're at price 15 and quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, which is 500. And let's say you as a consumer, you make a group and you protest that we want lower prices of petrol, it's so expensive for us. So the government would intervene in this scenario. So when government intervene, it means to benefit consumers, you impose a price ceiling. You never impose a price floor to benefit consumers. So a binding price ceiling means you're imposing a price below market equilibrium, which will distort the equilibrium. So let's see how it distorts equilibrium. So at a new price, which is 10, as a supplier, you cannot charge a price above 10 because it's a ceiling. You cannot go above the ceiling, but as a producer, you can charge price 10 or any price below 10, but never above 10. So you cannot go back to equilibrium price, which is 15. So at new price, your supply is only 200. So you notice a decrease in suppliers from 500 to 200. That is because of law of supply. Less price means supplier will supply less. And on the other hand, due to law of demand, there are 800 consumers because petrol is affordable, it's very cheap, so a lot of people would be preferring to buy petrol. So this creates a shortage of 600 because only 200 consumers will be able to buy the commodity because there are only 200 suppliers. Rest of the 600 won't be able to benefit. So that's why we say it's binding price ceiling because the market equilibrium is distorted and you cannot go back to equilibrium point unless government removes this price ceiling. But on the other hand, when you have a scenario of non-binding price ceiling, so it means that government imposes a price cap which is above equilibrium price. So I know it makes no sense that how you can benefit consumers if you're imposing a price above equilibrium. So that's why we call it non-binding because it does disrupts the market equilibrium for a short run, but in long run you get back to the initial market equilibrium point. How? So initially you're at price 15 and quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied at price 500. And government imposes a price ceiling above 15, which is 20 in this case. So when it's above equilibrium, it means it's a non-binding price ceiling. So let's see how it distorts the market for short run. So you notice at a higher price, you have 800 suppliers, but only 200 consumers, which is very simple due to law of demand and law of supply. A higher price is an incentive for suppliers to expand their production and supply more, but a higher price induces consumers to buy less. This is what happened here, but remember, we call it non-binding price ceiling due to a reason. Your market equilibrium is below the ceiling, and you can charge any price 20 or even any price below 20, but as a producer, you are not allowed to charge a price above 20. So in this scenario, as there would be few people buying petrol, you lower the market price and you can come back to equilibrium price where demand is equal to supply. That is only because the equilibrium was below the price ceiling. But what are the consequences of binding price ceiling? Even though you would say it's very beneficial for the consumers because it's a lower price, but it's not beneficial because you notice in the first graph there is a shortage. Previously, 500 consumers were able to benefit. Now only 200 consumers are benefiting. So price ceilings are not effective because whenever government imposes a binding price ceiling on competitive market, there is a shortage of goods, sellers ration scarce resources among large number of buyers, and rationing mechanisms are not desirable. Rationing is that the suppliers control the distribution of scarce resources. So it's not desirable for buyers because they may face discrimination. You might only prefer to give, let's say in this scenario, petrol to your family members, to your close friends, or you might discriminate on the basis of religion or race. So goods don't go to the buyers who value it most highly. So that's why rationing mechanism is not really effective, and even though price ceiling seems it's benefiting, it's not benefiting, and you see why it's not benefiting. So here we have the scenarios of price floor. The usual one is a binding price floor, but the other one is non-binding, which is not so common. Anyway, so price floors, it's a price control like price ceiling, but government imposes price floor to benefit not the consumer, not the buyers, but the other side, maybe workers or maybe producers. So a price floor is usually persuaded by producers saying that the equilibrium price is too low, we want a higher price. So government imposes a legal minimum price which is above the equilibrium. Or it can be applied on labor market. So the labor might say that this is such a low wage, we want higher wages. So in that case, government imposes a binding price floor which is always above the equilibrium. So here I'm not emphasizing on the market of a particular commodity, but the labor market because minimum wage law, it's a typical classic example for price floor. So you might notice instead of P as in prices, I have written W, which stands for wages because we're analyzing a labor market. And QL stands for quantity of labor. But if the case was of any commodity, so it would be a typical graph with price and quantity. So initially, the equilibrium wage of labor is $12, let's say, per hour. And the firm's demand is equal to the supply of labor, which is 500. So let's say the labor protest, we want higher wages, this is not sufficient for us, etc., etc. So government choose to benefit the labor and they impose a price floor. Now remember, we call a price floor usually a binding price floor because it always disrupts the market. And price floor will be above the equilibrium. Because if it's below equilibrium, it makes no sense. How can you benefit producers or labor if you, as a state, you impose a price or a wage below equilibrium? So price floor will be always above equilibrium. So when it's above equilibrium, you notice that at a higher wage, which is 20, the demand for labor decreases from 500 to 300. In simpler words, the firms, they do not want 500 labor, they only demand 300 labor because the cost of production has increased from 12 of labor to 20. So they would only prefer to have very skilled or competitive laborers. But on the other hand, you notice the supply of labor would increase. Labor know that they are offering a higher price, a higher wage. So many of the people would provide their services. But what do we notice here is there is a mismatch again. The demand for labor is less than the supply of labor. This leads to a surplus. And in simpler words, surplus is unemployment. Because here there is a surplus of labor. People would be unemployed. Previously, 500 people were employed. Now only 300 people are employed. But if you want to see how at the new price, how what is the amount of surplus, so it's 700 because 1,000 people are willing to work, but only 300 actually gets the job because that's what the firms demand. So 700 is the unemployment rate at the new price, which is 20. So even though you say price floor benefits the labors, but you see that there is a dark side of it as well. It causes unemployment. But remember, minimum wage does not apply for professionals or highly skilled personnel. It only applies to low skilled people or maybe students who are working and studying as well. So that's a disruption in market. That's why we call it binding price floor. So another example of a non-binding price floor case is again a labor market. So initially at wage 12, quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied, which is 500. But government imposes a price floor which is less than the market wage. So initial wage was 12, but government imposes a floor which is 8. So if it's below equilibrium, this would be a non-binding price floor because initially it might distort the equilibrium, but within, let's say, in long run, it will get back, you will get back to the market equilibrium, the shortage will be fixed. So you see that at a lower price, the supply is 300 because the labor is offered a less wage. Few people, as in 300 laborers, are willing to provide their services. Whereas the demand for labor has increased. Firm want 1,000 labor because if the wage of labor decreases, it means that they have to pay less wages and this is somehow saving their cost of production. So again, there is a mismatch. This leads to a shortage. But you can always get back to equilibrium point. Why? Because this is the scenario of price floor. Remember, you cannot go beneath the floor, but you can always go above the floor, or you can be at the floor. So you can charge price 8, you can charge price 12, you can charge a higher price than 12, but imposing a price floor, you cannot provide wage below 8 because it's a floor, you cannot go below floor. So automatically your shortage will fix itself because when as a firm you're not able to get laborers, required laborers, you provide them a higher wage and then labor provides them the services. So that's a non-binding price floor case. This is an application question. So if you know in application questions, you actually have to apply former concepts and develop certain links like beginning from demand and supply, the determinants, and even elasticity is important because here we are talking about short run and long run scenario. So the question states government imposes a binding price ceiling on rental apartments. As in government is trying to control rent and to provide cheaper housing to the public. So what will be the consequences in long run and short run? So let's begin with the short run scenario first. Initially, like it's not price but it's rent, but anyways you can consider price of housing. It's $800 for an apartment and quantity demand is equal to quantity supplied, which is 500. So you might find this graph a bit unusual because the supply curve is perfectly inelastic and the demand curve is relatively inelastic. So the reasons are very clear. We're analyzing rental market like housing and apartments. And regardless the price increases or decreases, supply curve remains unchanged because landlords they cannot respond to prices within few days or even months. For example, if price of rental apartment rises, so the landlord they cannot, build more houses overnight. Or if the market price of rental apartment decreases, they cannot kick out the tenants already living because the commitments are usually longer. So that's why the supply curve is perfectly inelastic. Supply curve will not change in short run. And coming towards demand, it's relatively inelastic, and again it's very clear you as a tenant, when the price increases, you cannot just switch to other houses or look for cheaper houses within few days. Or if the price decreases, again you cannot just switch houses because it's a time taking process and then you have longer commitments. So that's why the curves are inelastic in short run. So initially at when you're paying $800 rent, so government imposes a binding price ceiling. Remember, a price ceiling is to benefit buyers or consumers. It's not for the other sides, the producers or firms. So in this scenario, we'll be focusing on tenants because they are the one who demand apartments, and then you have the landlords who are actually providing the apartments. So government would impose a price ceiling below market equilibrium to benefit tenants so that the housing is cheaper for them. So you notice at the new point, the quantity supplied is 500, but quantity demanded is 600. So this creates a little shortage, and if you calculate, the shortage is 100. So you know that in a price ceiling, you can charge any price at the ceiling isn't 600 or below ceiling, which is below 600, but you cannot charge a price legally above 600. So you cannot go back to the equilibrium point unless government removes this price ceiling. So this is the short run scenario. Coming towards the long run case, it's very clear. In long run, the producers, the consumers, they have more time to react to changes, keeping in view the current scenario. So let's say if you're analyzing the same market after 4 to 5 years, so you notice the demand and supply curves are elastic here. That's because let's say if the price decreases, so the landlords, most of them can maybe exit the market or not provide houses for renting, maybe just use it for agricultural purposes or even give it to other businesses but won't give it for housing. And on the other hand, we as consumers, if let's say the price is high, we can look for cheaper apartments because in long run people have more time to react and adjust to changes. So the scenario is same. There is a price ceiling which is below the equilibrium point, so it's $600 for the same apartment. Here you notice quantity supplied is 300 and quantity demanded is 800. So here the shortage is a big number, which is 500. Because of less price, there are now only 300 landlords who are providing their apartments to rent, whereas the demand for apartments is 800 because the housing is cheaper. So this is a big shortage. And again, like I mentioned, you cannot fix a binding price ceiling until or unless government removes this, because you notice the equilibrium is above price ceiling, it's not below price ceiling. So even though we assume that rental apartments controlling rent is very important and efficient, but do you really think it is efficient keeping in view what happened? There is such a big shortage, people don't have houses to live. So economists share two point of view. Those who have a perspective as per price ceiling. They say that it's the best way to raise living standards of poor people by providing cheaper houses. But on the other hand, economists who disagree with respect to price ceiling on rental apartments, they say it's the second destructive thing after war. First, we look at the demand side. We know that buyers will demand more housing because it's quite affordable, and even people will migrate to cities from rural areas due to low rent. So this will create a mismatch, like there would be so many people homeless, and even it will increase crime rates. And on the other hand, first of all, you have less suppliers left because the price is low. And the suppliers who are already in market, they would choose to compromise on maintenance of house because the market price is already low. So the tenants they had to adjust. Other than that, the landlords they can also discriminate. Maybe they don't prefer to give housing to people with like couple with children, or they might discriminate based on religion or not give someone their apartment on the basis of race, or maybe does not prefer a foreigner. So these are the issues which arises. There are pros and cons of each scenario. So this is all for this chapter. It's a bit conceptual chapter because you kind of develop association between the prior concept. So please read in detail and practice the questions.